22 years. That's how long I thought I had a good marriage. Then I found a receipt in my wife's coat pocket. 3 days later, I booked the cabin next to hers and brought his sister as my guest. What happened that weekend ended 2 relationships and started something I never expected. My name is Garrett. I'm 51 years old, and until 4 months ago, I was the kind of man who believed that if you worked hard, stayed faithful, and showed up every day, life would be fair to you. I know better now. I'm a civil engineer. I've spent the last 26 years designing bridges and overpasses for the state of Oregon. It's not glamorous work. It doesn't make for interesting dinner party conversation. But it's honest work, and I've always taken pride in that, in building things that last, things you can trust to hold weight. The irony of that isn't lost on me now. My wife, Renee, is a pharmaceutical sales rep. Has been for 14 years. Good at it, too. She's the kind of person who walks into a room and immediately knows who to talk to, what to say, how to make people feel seen. I fell in love with that quality when we met at a conference in Portland, back when we were both 29. She was covering a booth for her company. I was there for a structural engineering seminar on the other side of the convention center. I got lost looking for the bathroom and found her instead. 22 years later, we had 2 kids, a 4-bedroom house in Lake Oswego, and what I believed was a solid life. Our son Caleb is 19, finishing his first year at Oregon State. Our daughter Nora is 16, sharp as a tack, the kind of teenager who notices everything but says nothing until she's ready. We were not a perfect family. I know that now. I knew it then, too, I think. I just didn't want to look at it directly. Renee traveled a lot for work. That was always part of the deal. Sales reps move, they drive, they fly, they conference. I accepted that early. I handled dinners, school pickups, parent-teacher nights. I told myself I was being a supportive partner. What I didn't tell myself, what I refused to look at, was that somewhere along the way, we had stopped being partners at all. We were more like 2 people managing the same household from separate rooms. Polite, functional, hollow. I found the receipt on the Tuesday evening in March. Renee had asked me to grab her gray coat from the closet so she could take it to the dry cleaner. I reached into the pocket to check for anything before I bagged it, which I always did. She loses pens that way, and I pulled out a folded piece of paper. Dinner receipt. Larkspur Restaurant in Cannon Beach. 2 entrees, 1 bottle of wine, dessert. $187. Date 7. Date the previous Saturday. Renee had told me she was visiting her college roommate Jody in Salem that Saturday. I stood in the closet for a long time. Just stood there holding that paper. The house was quiet. Nora was at volleyball practice. The refrigerator hummed from the kitchen. I remember thinking very clearly, don't panic. Don't do anything right now. You don't know enough yet. I put the receipt back in the pocket. I am not a confrontational person by nature. In my work, when something doesn't add up, you don't start pulling wires. You study the structure first. You figure out where the stress is concentrated before you touch anything. I applied the same logic here, even though my hands were shaking when I put Renee's coat back on the hanger. That evening, I waited until she was in the shower. Her phone was on the nightstand. I knew her passcode. Caleb's birthday hadn't changed in years. I opened it. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was hoping to be wrong. I wasn't wrong. His name was Philip. He worked at one of the medical groups she covered. A hospitalist, according to his LinkedIn, which I found within 10 minutes of seeing his name. 44 years old. Divorced, according to his Facebook, though the post announcing that was almost 2 years old. He and Renee had been texting through a regular messaging app, which surprised me. No encrypted chat, no secret app. Either they were careless, or they had decided they didn't need to be careful. Both options made my stomach turn. The messages went back almost 8 months. I didn't read all of them. I read enough. There was a weekend in January she said was a training conference in Bend. There was a Thursday in February she said she'd gotten stuck in traffic on the way back from a client visit. There was a Saturday in Cannon Beach with the dinner receipt. Larkspur, $187, 1 bottle of wine. 2 people who were not strangers pretending the world outside didn't exist. I took screenshots. Every screen I could get to before I heard the water shut off. Then I put the phone back exactly as I'd found it, rolled over, and pretended to be asleep when she came to bed. I don't know how I slept that night. I think my brain just gave up from exhaustion. The next morning was Wednesday. Renee made coffee, kissed me on the cheek, told me she had an early call with her regional manager. Normal morning. She asked if I could pick up Nora from practice on Friday because she had a work dinner. I said of course. She smiled. I smiled back. I watched her back out of the driveway and I thought, how many times have I watched her leave and had no idea where she was actually going? I called my brother Owen that afternoon for my truck during lunch. He's 3 years younger than me, works in IT security, understands more about data and trails and digital footprints than anyone I know. I told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" I said I wanted to know everything. The full picture. Before I did anything. Before I said a word to Renee. I wanted to know exactly what I was dealing with. Owen helped me access our joint cell account. My name is the primary on the plan, including Renee's line, so the records were mine to see legally. Call logs going back 6 months. Philip's number appeared 94 times. 94 times. I also ran a search on Philip. Professionally, he was respected. Medically, he had a clean record. Personally, and this is the part that mattered, he had a sister named Diane who ran a small outdoor gear shop in Astoria. I found her business page, her email. I looked at her photo for a long time. She had an open, honest face. The kind of face that looked like it didn't keep secrets easily. I drafted an email, deleted it, drafted an email, deleted it, drafted another. It took me 4 tries to get it right. I kept it brief. My name, what I did, what I had found, and a request to meet somewhere neutral. I told her I believed we had information that affected us both, and that I thought she deserved to know what I knew. I told her I wasn't looking to cause a scene or make anyone's life harder than it already was. I was looking for the truth. She replied in 2 hours. She said she'd suspected something for months. She said her brother had been different, secretive, evasive, canceling family plans last minute. She said she'd tried to ask him about it and he brushed her off. She agreed to meet me the following Monday at a coffee shop in Astoria. I sat across from Diane for almost 2 hours. She was composed in the way that people are composed when they've been holding something together for a long time and are relieved to finally set it down. She'd done her own quiet investigating. She had found charges on a credit card Philip had listed her as an emergency contact for hotel stays, restaurant bills, a weekend at a rental property on the coast that he'd told her was a fishing trip with colleagues. By the time we left that coffee shop, we both knew the same thing. This had been going on since at least last July. And it was not casual. I'd been aware of a cabin situation before I met Diane, but talking to her made it concrete. Renee had mentioned, almost offhandedly, 3 weeks earlier, that she was thinking of doing a solo retreat in April. She'd said she needed to decompress, that the quarter had been brutal, that she just wanted 2 or 3 days somewhere quiet with no agenda. I'd said that sounded like a great idea. I'd even helped her look at options online, sitting right beside her on the couch, looking at rental cabin listings on the coast. She'd booked one in Manzanita, sent the confirmation to her personal email, which I didn't have access to, but I knew the dates, April 11th through the 13th. I did not know at that point that Philip had told Diane he'd be off the grid that same weekend for a medical volunteer event in rural Washington. Diane found that out when she mentioned the dates to me in passing. We both went quiet at the same time. I said, "I think we should be there." She said, "I think you're right." I called the rental company in Manzanita the next day, asked if there were any availability near a specific property. I gave the address of the cabin Renee had booked. The woman on the phone said there were 2 adjacent cabins in that cluster, and one was open the same weekend. I booked it, paid in full, put it in my name. Then I told Nora that I had a work thing that required an overnight on the coast that weekend, and arranged for her to stay with my parents. She gave me a look. Nora gives looks that could peel paint, but she didn't push it. Renee left on the morning of April 11th. She kissed me goodbye at the door, said she'd text when she arrived, said she just needed a few days to breathe. I nodded, told her to enjoy herself, watched her car disappear down the street. Then I sat down at the kitchen table for about 20 minutes, just sitting, not thinking, just sitting. Diane and I drove down separately and met at a gas station in Seaside before the last stretch. She looked like she hadn't slept. I probably didn't look much better. We didn't talk a lot on that drive. There wasn't much to say that we hadn't already said. We arrived at the rental cluster around 4 in the afternoon. Renee's car was already there, parked in front of cabin 3. Ours was cabin 4, literally 15 feet away, sharing a small gravel path and a cedar fence. The kind of setup where, if you sat on your porch, you could easily see who came and went from the cabin next door. Philip's car arrived at 5:42. I know the exact time because I was sitting in the Adirondack chair on our porch with a cup of coffee and I looked at my watch when I heard the gravel crunch. I watched him get out. He was carrying a duffel bag and a bottle of wine. He knocked on the door of cabin 3. The door opened. He went inside. Diane had come out onto the porch by then and stood beside me. Neither of us said anything for a minute. She finally said, quietly, "Okay." "So," I said, "Yeah. We didn't go over that evening. We made dinner in the cabin kitchen. Diane had brought groceries, which I thought was both practical and quietly impressive. And we sat at the small table and talked. Not about Philip and Renee. About other things. She told me about her shop, about kayaking, about a trip she'd taken to Iceland before her father got sick. I told her about bridge design, about the satisfaction of watching something you've calculated on paper become something real that people drive across every day without thinking about. We talked like two people who had met under strange circumstances and found, to their surprise, that they had things to say to each other. The next morning, Saturday, we were both on the porch by 8. It was a clear April morning, the ocean air sharp and cold. Philip came out of cabin 3 around 8:15 to throw something in the recycling bin. He looked up, saw me, and went completely still. I raised my coffee cup at him. He looked like he'd been hit with something. He went back inside. Within 2 minutes, I could hear voices through the thin cabin walls. Not words, just the sound of an urgent, low conversation happening very fast. The door to cabin 3 opened again. Renee came out. She was wearing a gray fleece I'd given her for her birthday 2 years ago. She crossed the small gravel path and stood at the cedar fence that separated our porches. She looked at me. She looked at Diane. She looked back at me. "Garrett." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" It wasn't a question. She knew what I was doing there. She just needed something to say. "I booked this cabin 3 weeks ago," I said. "Same time you booked yours." Philip appeared in the doorway of cabin 3 behind her. When he saw Diane, he took a visible step backward. Diane stood up from her chair. She was calm in a way I genuinely admired. She said, "Philip, we should talk." He started to say her name. She said, "Don't. Just come sit down." There is a particular kind of silence that falls over people when they realize the version of the world they've been living in has just ended. I've seen it in meetings when a structural report comes back with results nobody wanted. The silence before people start figuring out what it means. That was the silence on that porch. The 4 of us sat at the outdoor table between the 2 cabins. It was awkward in a way that felt almost surreal. 4 adults at a picnic table in the morning sun on the Oregon coast, having the most important, terrible conversation of at least 2 of their lives. Renee tried, at first, to explain. She used the word complicated. She used the phrase, "I've been struggling." She said she felt like she had been disappearing, like the life we'd built together had started to feel like a role she was playing rather than a life she was actually living. She said she didn't mean for it to go this far. I let her talk. I've learned over the years that you understand more about a situation if you let people say what they actually think rather than interrupting with what you think. So I sat and I listened, and I watched her face, which I have known for 22 years, and I thought you could have told me any of this, any single part of it. And instead you drove to Cannon Beach for dinner and came home and asked me how my day was. When she finished, I put a folder on the picnic table. Printed call logs, hotel receipts, screenshots of the messages I'd been able to capture. I didn't do it with drama. I just set it down. I said, "I've known for 3 weeks. I've been building the full picture before I said anything, because I needed to be sure I wasn't reacting to something I'd misunderstood. I have not misunderstood anything." Renee stared at the folder. I said, "I also need you to know that I've thought a lot these past 3 weeks about whether I contributed to this, whether I was absent in ways I didn't see. I probably was. I know I'm not an exciting person. I know I come home tired and talk about work problems you find boring and forget to ask about your day as often as I should. I know we drifted, and I know drifting takes 2 people." I paused. "But I would have talked about it if you had ever said, 'Garrett, I'm unhappy. Garrett, I feel invisible. Garrett, something is wrong.' I would have listened. I would have gone to counseling. I would have tried. You never gave me the chance to try. Instead, you spent 8 months lying to my face, and that part has nothing to do with anything I did or didn't do. That part is entirely yours." Philip had been quiet through all of this. He looked at Diane once, sideways, and she looked back at him with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not anger, exactly. Something more like grief. She said to him, steadily, I want you to know that I found the hotel charges in February. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure what I was looking at, and I wanted to believe I was wrong. I see now that I wasn't wrong. She put her own papers on the table. Not many. A couple of printed bank statements, a few screenshots she'd taken of his calendar. I'm not here to make a scene. I'm here because I think the truth deserves to be in the same room as the people who created it. Philip started to speak. Diane put her hand up once, briefly, and he stopped. We stayed at that picnic table for a long time, long enough for the morning to warm up, for the sound of the ocean to start feeling normal again. At some point, someone made more coffee, and no one remarked on it. There was no shouting. There was no moment of dramatic collapse. There was just 4 people working through something painful in the daylight, which is maybe harder than any dramatic collapse because it requires you to stay in your chair and keep talking. By noon, Renee and Philip had both understood. This was not salvageable. Not the marriage, not the relationship between them. Once it was out in the open, with all the evidence on the table and the flat morning light, it seemed to lose whatever power it had held when it was a secret. Secrets have a kind of gravity. The truth is lighter. But the landing still hurts. Renee asked if she could talk to me alone. Philip and Diane walked down the path toward the beach, giving us space. We sat on the porch of cabin 3 together. We hadn't sat that close to each other in a long time. She said, I don't know how to fix this. I said, I don't think it can be fixed. I think it can only be dealt with honestly. She asked about Nora. She asked about Caleb. She asked what I was going to tell them. I said, I'm going to tell them the truth, in an age-appropriate way. And I'm going to do it without making them feel like they have to choose sides. You're still their mother. That doesn't change. She was crying by then, quietly, looking out at the tree line. I noticed she was still wearing the fleece I'd given her. I thought about the person who had picked it out, who had wrapped it, who had watched her open it at the kitchen table while Nora took pictures, and Caleb complained that cake came before presents in this family. I thought about all the Saturdays and all the years. The ordinary, irreplaceable ones. The ones you don't know to memorize when they're happening. I said, I genuinely don't know yet if I'm angry. I feel like anger is waiting for me somewhere down the road. Right now, I'm just tired and sad and I want to go home. She nodded. I drove back to Portland that afternoon. Diane drove back to Astoria. We'd exchanged numbers in a practical way. There might be legal things to coordinate, since Philip had talked to Renee about the possibility of her helping him find a new practice, which created some potential professional complications my attorney later sorted out. But that wasn't why I gave her my number, and I don't think that was why she gave me hers. Nora called me that evening from my parents' place. She said she'd heard it in my voice for months, that something was off, and she asked me to just tell her. I told her, not everything, not the detail, but the shape of it, that her mother and I were going to be separating, that it had nothing to do with her or Caleb, that I loved her, and that part would not change under any circumstances ever. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Are you going to be okay? I said, I think so. It's going to take a while. She said, I want to come home. I said, I'll pick you up in the morning. Caleb came home from school 2 weekends later. We sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where Renee had made coffee every morning for 14 years, and I told him what I'd told Nora. He took it differently. He's more like Renee in some ways, processes things internally, went quiet and stayed quiet through most of the conversation. When he finally spoke, he asked me if this was something that had been building for a long time, or if it came out of nowhere. I said, probably both. The problems were building for a long time. Finding out came out of nowhere. He nodded slowly. He said, I used to think you guys were like solid, like the baseline that would just always be there. I said, I know. I'm sorry that changed. He said, it's not your fault. He said it so directly, with such clarity, that I had to look away for a second. The divorce was filed in June. Our attorney recommended mediation since we were in agreement on most of the major points. The house would be sold and the equity divided. Renee would take her car and I would take mine. We would share parenting time with Nora, whose school and life were rooted in Portland. Caleb was technically an adult, but he made his own quiet preferences clear by spending both summer breaks at home with me. I didn't push it. He's old enough to know his own mind. Renee and Philip's relationship ended 6 weeks after Manzanita. I heard about it secondhand through Nora, who had gradually reopened a careful, limited line of communication with her mother. He had apparently told Renee, not long after that weekend, that he wasn't ready for the kind of commitment that the situation would require. I think the reality of what they'd done What did it cost? Would it expose, change something for him? Sometimes the thing you thought you wanted looks different when the secret keeping it alive is gone. Diane called me in July, ostensibly to ask a question about the letter my attorney had drafted regarding Philip's involvement in a professional referral that affected Renee's client territory. We spent 45 minutes on the phone and addressed the professional question in the first 5 minutes. I drove to Astoria in August. Her shop was exactly what I'd imagined from her description. Small, warm, organized in the way that only someone who genuinely loves gear and the outdoors can organize it. She took me out on a kayak that afternoon. I had not kayaked that afternoon. I had not kayaked since I was a teenager. I was terrible at it. She found this genuinely funny, and I found her finding it funny to be genuinely good. I want to be careful here. I want to be honest about what this is and what it isn't. I am not a man who rebounds easily or rushes. I've been building things too long to confuse a foundation with a finished structure. Diane and I have spent time together, and that time has been real and good, and I won't minimize it by calling it something less than what it is. But I'm also 51 years old, and I know that grief takes the time it takes, and I'm not going to skip past it to get somewhere I think I should be faster. What I know is this. I went to Manzanita looking for the truth. I found it. It was brutal and necessary, and it broke something that, looking back, had already been breaking for years beneath the surface. The way a support beam can be compromised long before anyone sees a crack. The crack was always there. I just hadn't known where to look. The house in Lake Oswego sold in October. I rent a smaller place now, closer to downtown. Nora has her own room. There's a good coffee shop 2 blocks away where I work on weekend mornings, reviewing project specs, watching the rain. Oregon has extraordinary rain. I've lived here my whole life, and I still think that. Caleb drove down last month and we went to see the new pedestrian bridge I'd worked on. The one that finally opened after 4 years of design and construction delays and bureaucratic complications that would bore anyone but me to describe. We stood on it at dusk, both of us in jackets, looking out over the water. He said, "You built this, right?" I said, "More or less." He said, "That's actually kind of incredible, Dad." It is, I thought. It actually is. Nora came to me a few weeks ago on a Sunday evening doing homework at the kitchen table. She looked up from her laptop and said, "Dad, do you think people actually change, or do they just get better at hiding who they are?" I thought about it seriously, the way she deserved. I said, "I think some people change and some people hide, and I think the difference is whether they're willing to be honest when hiding stops working." She chewed on that for a minute. Then she went back to her homework. I'm not angry at Renee. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect anger from a story like this, and I understand why. But anger is a hard thing to sustain when you're also honest with yourself about how 2 people arrive at a place where one of them is lying and the other isn't paying attention. We both built the distance, even if only one of us chose to fill it the way she did. I've sat with that a long time, and I think it's true. What I am is clear in a way I haven't been in years. I know what I want. I know what I'm not willing to accept. I know that showing up every day for the people you love is not the same thing as actually being present for them. And I've been working on understanding the difference. I have a good job, 2 kids who trust me, a rain-soaked city I've built parts of, and a woman in Astoria who laughs at my kayaking and means it. That is not a bad hand. Given everything, that is not a bad hand at all. I spent most of my career calculating load-bearing capacity. How much weight a structure can hold before something gives. The answer is almost never about a single bad moment. It's about accumulated stress over time, invisible to anyone who isn't looking closely, until the day it isn't invisible anymore. I think about that a lot when I think about what happened with Renee. The receipt in the coat pocket didn't break my marriage. The 8 months of lies didn't break my marriage. What broke my marriage was years of 2 people deciding, separately and silently, that the distance between them was just the cost of busy lives, and neither one saying out loud that the cost had gotten too high. Renee filled that distance with Philip. I filled it with work and routine and the comfortable assumption that solid meant fine. Neither of us was right. One of us was honest about it. One of us wasn't. I want to be careful not to make this into something cleaner than it is. Cause and effect in a marriage is not a straight line. I was absent in real ways. I missed things I should have seen. But there is a difference, and I believe this firmly, between a problem and a choice. The problems between Renee and me were shared. The choice to lie, to deceive, to construct a second life while pretending the first one was intact. That choice was hers alone, And I think one of the most important things I've had to learn in the past year is how to hold both of those truths at the same time without letting one cancel the other out. What I keep coming back to is this: the truth, once you actually let it into the room, has a way of restructuring everything around it. I didn't go to Manzanita to cause pain. I went because I had spent 3 weeks watching someone I'd spent 22 years with look me in the eye and say things she knew were not true, and I couldn't live inside that anymore. I needed the real version, even if the real version was worse. It was worse, and it was also the only thing that made any of what came next possible. The honest conversations with Caleb and Nora, the divorce that was handled with something close to dignity, the slow, uncomfortable process of figuring out who I am when I'm not somebody's husband. Nora asked me once if I thought people could change. I gave her the honest answer: some do, some just get better at hiding. I've thought about that distinction a lot since then. What makes the difference, I think, is whether a person is willing to be accountable when hiding stops working. Not just sorry, accountable. There's a difference. Sorry is about your own discomfort with what you've done. Accountable is about what you actually owe the people you've hurt. I don't know if Renee has found her way to that. I genuinely hope she does, for Nora's sake, for Caleb's sake, for her own. That's not a performance of generosity. I mean it. Carrying unexamined choices forward is a heavy load, and I've seen what it looks like from the outside. What I know about myself now, at 51, standing on a bridge I helped build, watching my son look at it the way you look at something that surprises you. What I know is that integrity is not something you display. It's something you practice in the moments nobody's watching. It's what you do with the receipt in the coat pocket. It's how you talk to your daughter at midnight when she's already figured out more than you wanted her to know. It's choosing a harder, slower, more honest road when the easier one is right there. I chose it, and I'd choose it again.